Hey guys, Paul here once again with VHScollector.com, here to bring you another horror VHS review, and today we are going back to the roots. We are going to be reviewing an American slasher film from the early 80s called Honeymoon Horror. But before we talk about this movie, I want to remind you guys that we have a crowdfunding campaign going on for the rebuilding and expanding of VHScollector.com. I still have about 20 or 30,000 VHS covers to add to the website, and we're going to add some really cool features. So check out the link below for the details, or the link on this video, and if you're interested in preserving a piece of cultural history, maybe you'll contribute something. So let's talk about Honeymoon Horror. Now, this is one of the very first horror VHSs that I ever tracked down. I think I read about it in a book or something, I don't know, but I've had this one for a very long time, and most of the images of this cover art that you see online is of my exact tape, the one that you're seeing here. They just cut off this bottom part. I scanned this a long time ago for Slasher Index, and a lot of those covers just spread all over the place, all over the internet, so it's a little piece of trivia for you. But this was released by Sony, probably in the mid 80s somewhere. The movie was made in 1982. There's a little bit of an interesting backstory behind this movie. So it was made in Austin, Texas by a guy named Harry Preston. He wrote the movie, directed it, and there's some information online about the director and some information about this movie, and I don't know what the resources are. People just mention it in reviews. Apparently there's a director's cut of this movie out there, and if there's an interview with the director, I'd love to read it, but I can't find any information, so I can't confirm a lot of the details. But anyway, from what I understand, he made the movie for $50,000. He sold it to Sony for $50,000, and Sony went on to make $22 million off of it. Poor Harry Preston just walked away with the same amount of money that he put into it, so it's kind of funny. It skipped theatrical release. It had no theatrical release. So this is one of the early movies that went straight to video. Now, the movie wasn't made for the video market specifically, but it did skip the theatrical run, which is an interesting little detail about this. Now, I love the cover art to this movie. You've got this couple on a bed. It's surrounded by blood. You've got this burned creature holding a heart. He's on fire, and he has a bloody axe in his hand. Some great artwork, and of course it has the perfect tagline, "Till death do us part." I think there's actually several horror films with that tagline in it. It's just perfect for this. And if you look on the back, this is a big spoiler. At the end of the movie, the killer's revealed, and it's the burned, disfigured ex-husband of one of the characters in the movie. Usually in a horror movie, they save the killer's face for the end to be this big reveal, but for whatever reason, they thought this was necessary. Now, if you look at the credits on this movie on IMDb, almost no one from this movie went on to any success. I think there's like maybe one or two people that had a little bit of success, but Harry Preston, the guy who wrote and directed it, did nothing. He never made another movie. But there's an interesting article in the Dallas Observer from 20 years ago where they're doing, I guess, some kind of local story on this local screenwriter, and he holds these screenwriting workshops at his house. And it's a funny article to read. They briefly touch on this movie, but they interview a few people who know Harry, and they kind of describe him as a hack who thinks he's some Hollywood mogul. It's a very interesting and funny article. You should totally check it out. But he kind of describes how Sony picked up the movie and they hacked it up and they re-edited it and they changed the ending, and there's not much data there, but it's interesting enough. The film begins like many slashers from the early 80s, with something terrible happening in the past. In this case, a man finds his wife, Elaine, cheating on him with another man. The two fight, resulting with the husband being knocked out and accidentally set on fire. Instead of saving her husband, Elaine leaves the body there, and she runs off with her boyfriend. As the body burns, the credits roll, with many of them obscured by the bright flames. When they finish, it's a year later, although not indicated by any title card like most movies. From the local pervy sheriff, we learn that Elaine remarried and rebuilt the home that burned, and turned the island into a honeymoon resort. We then meet three incredibly obnoxious sorority girls, who visit the resort to decorate the cabins of their three newlywed sorority sisters as a surprise. Two of the girls are grabbed and killed off screen, while another waiting at the dock is butchered. The maid is also killed off screen and found in a closet. Meanwhile, the film jumps back to the mainland, with the fat pervy sheriff serving as comedy relief. Other than his exposition earlier in the film, his scenes add nothing to advance the plot. The three newlywed couples arrive on the island the next day, and are escorted to their cabins. On the way, Elaine ruins the surprise left by their fellow sorority sisters the day before. She mentions she'll have the maid straighten up the decorated rooms before the couples even had a chance to see them. The rest of the film consists of truckloads of sexual innuendos.
Look at those muscles, 18 inches.
I hope you're talking about his arms, dear.
There's women being frightened, and eventually nearly all of the inhabitants of the island being knocked off one by one. In total, there's probably around 10 deaths, only of which 5 appear on screen, most being carried out by an axe. When the boat and dock is set ablaze, the men are quick to blame the groundskeeper, Crazy Joe, who Elaine describes earlier in the film as,
"He's a little retarded and he can't speak, but he understands, so if you need anything, just ask him and he'll get it for you."
The men hunt him down and tie him up. In the final act of the film, Frank, the ex-husband thought to have died in the fire, busts through the door, throwing an axe into the skull of Elaine. He is then shot through the window by one of the husbands. Oh, God! Ah! But doesn't die until getting one last kill in. The next morning, when the sheriff arrives on the island, we learn from one of the husbands that the other two swam to the mainland, although never wound up, and that the only surviving girl was sent to the hospital. Of course, we don't see any of this. Shortly after, on his cop car's telephone, he is told that a rescue crew found Crazy Joe in a cave on the island with the body of Frank, intent on burying it. This would have been a great final twist to show on screen, but of course, they literally phone it in. Now, although the movie has some bad acting and some terrible direction, it's quite entertaining. It definitely has the feel of an early 80s slasher film. This was made during the golden age of slasher films in 1982, so it had a lot of inspiration. It probably could have benefited from more gore scenes. A lot of the deaths are off screen, as I mentioned, which is unfortunate, but there are a few interesting or humorous axe murder scenes in there. The scenes with the sheriff are awful, and they kind of ruined this movie. And I was reading a review online, and someone got their hands on a really bad director's cut of this movie, and according to this person, the director's cut cuts out most of the sheriff scenes in the movie. The sheriff scenes, according to what I read online, were added to bring some levity to the movie. It was too bleak for Sony apparently, and they wanted more humor, and it kind of shows because every time, as I mentioned before, the sheriff shows up, it's something humorous. It has nothing really to do with the plot. Now, although there's a ton of reviews for this movie online, it's still out of print. I guess it's not that obscure if there's all these reviews online for it. I guess Sony pumped out a ton of these. I mean, they did make $22 million off of it. But will we ever see a release of this? Like I said, it was never released on DVD. From what I understand, Sony owns this, obviously. They own the movie, and I'm sure it's on the very, very bottom of their list of movies to release. And according to something else I read, the print of this movie is in really, really bad shape. I don't know how anyone would know that unless they're in the Sony vaults. It just seems like the perfect title for someone like Vinegar Syndrome to release, right? And I'm sure that there are a lot of people that inquired about this, but it's really hard to get your hands on a lot of these studio-owned titles. Why would they license it out if they could just do it themselves? That's their kind of thought process, but some of these movies get lost in that thought process, and they just get stuck on the bottom of the list, and they never see the light of day again. And then these studios want to know why people are bootlegging their movies. Give me a break, really. Like, if people are bootlegging this movie, I mean, that means that there's an audience for it. Just release the movie. I think a lot of studios are trying to do that with like the Warner Archive and Video on Demand, but we still haven't seen a decent print of this movie. We just see this VHS. Yeah, that's Honeymoon Horror. Very entertaining slasher film. It's poorly made. It has a very regional feel to it, like an amateur regional feel. It feels like the locals got involved in making this movie. It kind of shows through some of the locations and their acting, certainly. But that adds a kind of charm to it. I think some people kind of appreciate that. So it definitely is worth seeking out. It doesn't have a lot of gore in it, but it has enough to make it a slasher film, I guess. A lot of those deaths are off screen, but there's still a lot here to appreciate despite the bad acting, the bad clothing, and the bad direction. So this has been Paul with VHScollector.com, and I will see you guys next time. Thanks.